everyone, and welcome to the 2024-2025 Marshall Interview. My name is Razan Amine, and I'm a third-year PhD student in economics at University of Cambridge. And with me is Professor Jim Poterba, a Mitsui Professor of Economics at MIT and the President of MBER. Professor Jim is a distinguished economist whose research focuses on how taxation affects economic decisions of households as well as firms, particularly involving saving and portfolio behavior. His Marshall lecture, later today, is titled Retirement Security in an Aging Population. To begin with, Professor Jim, a very warm welcome to Cambridge University.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's kickstart this conversation by you telling us a little bit about your lecture.
Well, I'll be giving two lectures, and the first one is quite general and talks about the challenge of providing for old age retirement income in a world which is growing increasingly old. So there's a bit of a micro component to this, which is thinking about how any individual would plan for their later years. There's also a macro component, which is that as the UK, the US, and most of the developed world grows older, combination of extended lifespans in late life and declining fertility, the challenges for the macroeconomy of providing for resources of the old becomes greater. If an economy has a large, high population growth rate, you've got lots of young people relative to the older population. That makes it easier for a government, for example, to use taxes on the labor income of the young to provide for Social Security or pension payments for the old. As the population pyramid becomes more rectangular or even an inverted triangle, you end up with a situation where that becomes much more difficult. And that's kind of what we've been playing out in Western Europe, in the UK, and the US as population dynamics have changed. This puts more pressure on the other elements of providing for retirement security, individual saving for retirement, or employer-provided work schemes that are pension plans offered in the workplace. Here in the UK, about 20 years ago, the Turner Report took a systemic look at the pension structure in the private sector in the UK, made a number of important recommendations. Many of them were implemented. That doesn't always happen when commissions make reports. But as a result, the UK is actually in a reasonable position today. But there are a number of features that probably bear attention. The Institute for Financial Studies, Fiscal Studies in London has recently begun a pensions review looking at some of these issues. Around 20% of all folks who are workers are not contributing to a pension at this point. For self-employed individuals, the number is much greater, closer to 80% of them are not contributing. And I think the real issue is, how is the level of savings lining up against what is needed to provide for an adequate retirement income? So those are some of the questions I'm going to be tackling in the first lecture. Second lecture will focus on private markets and ways individuals can ensure one of the big risks that they face in late life, which is longevity risk. Now, somehow only an economist could come and say, if you live a very long life, that's a risk. You got the bad draw from that. Well, you didn't get a bad draw of living a long time, but if you've been planning for a 15-year or 20-year retirement and you turned out to live for 30 years, you might end up discovering that your financial resources were wearing thin at the end. There is a market which can enable you to insure that risk. It's the annuity market, where effectively an annuity is a reverse life insurance contract. In life insurance, you give the insurance company a small payment every year, and if something adverse happens and you pass away, the insurance company pays your heirs a substantial amount. With an annuity, it's just the opposite. With an annuity, you give the insurance company money up front, and they give you a payment for as long as you're alive. And that protects you against the risk that you live longer than expected. It's just using sort of the law of large numbers to be able to let the insurance company write policies and let the individuals draw down with those policies. But insurance markets like that don't always work perfectly. If you have better information about your lifespan than the insurance company does, you'll be more likely to buy products that are designed for people to be paid until they live a long time. If you know you're going to live a long time, you'll be more likely to buy it. And that can cause very standard market failure problems that we study in microeconomics. So the working of markets like the annuity market is something which is of interest to our micro theory and applied micro friends. But it also has this consequence of being important for thinking about how as a society we can use markets versus the state to address the risks of late life financial challenge, in particular the longevity risk. So I'll talk a little bit about how those markets function, provide some evidence on adverse selection and its consequences, and then really conclude by talking about what I'll call the role of state compulsion as a way of pulling people into markets like that and trying to avoid the adverse selection.
Thanks so much for summarizing the two parts of the lecture on the 2 days. I guess I'll start with the kind of first part with a follow-up question. So is it a fair way to summarize the challenges that people could face as demand-side frictions and supply-side frictions for retirement plans? And what do you see is the most pressing challenge of aging populations in terms of their kind of obstacles to secure a stable retirement? Does it speak to these two types of frictions? How can we think and structure it? What is the biggest challenge in that?
It's a great question. I think the hardest challenge is one that lies at the heart of getting people to save. Right? And saving and Alfred Marshall wrote about saving in Principles of Economics. He talked about this in a very neoclassical way, not surprisingly, but thought of and postulated essentially a rational consumer who was thinking about providing for old age while working, and did some simple verbal comparative statics on the way in which savings would respond if people knew they were going to live a longer time or had expenses in late life. Everything he described was exactly what you would expect in a neoclassical model, but the challenge is that many times people seem to have a lot of trouble saving. And that can come from several different sources, some of which I would put in the category of frictions, and some of which I would put in the category of behavioral challenges. The frictions might be if I am a liquidity constrained household and I don't have access to an emergency fund which would let me borrow if I have a medical shock or another source of financial need during my midlife years, I might decide that the absence of that kind of market or the absence of insurance for that would lead me to want to keep money in a rainy day fund and not contribute it to a retirement account, which might be the way I would lock it up for my retirement assets. There might be other sources of, I might not have access to a retirement saving plan in the workplace. And if my employer has not made something available for me because I'm a low income worker and I don't have to meet the standards of being offered a plan. In the US, we have small firms, because of the regulatory burdens, seem to offer plans to their workers much less frequently. Those are considerations which might make it hard for me to do the savings I'd like. But even if I postulate that I've got a good workplace saving plan and I have an income which might allow me to provide some resources for retirement, we still see some pretty low savings rates in lots of households. And that's because, at least if you do surveys in the United States, if you ask people, do you think it would be a good idea to increase the amount you save? A lot of people say, yep, that'd be a good idea. If you then say, would you be prepared to reduce the amount you consume? Oh, no way. Okay, now you and I think of that as two sides of the same coin, and they're really asking the same question. But the very fact that you get different answers when you ask the question different ways suggests something about the framing and also about the behavioral economics of how people think about consuming today versus consuming tomorrow. And I think the challenge of communicating in various ways the importance of how much you save, especially reasonably early in your career, because the magnificent power of compound interest enables you to get to much larger balances of retirement accumulations if you do start saving early than if you try to catch up late in your 50s and early 60s. It's very difficult to build those large balances. So that's an important reason for getting people to start early. At the same time, I mean, you might well point out, wait a minute, I'm early in my career. I expect my earnings profile is going to be steeply sloped. Why should I be saving when I'm 25 or 30 if I think I'm going to be earning in real terms twice as much when I'm 45 or even more? And doesn't that suggest that I should defer my savings? And of course, this means it's all a complicated economic optimization problem. And depending on the circumstances of the individual, what we would predict their life cycle to look like, we might come up with different recommendations about how and when they should save. But I think that all comes to, it's more on the demand side frictions, I would say, around the ability to create the savings pool that's needed than on the supply side frictions. Although there are certainly some supply side frictions that I would put the the offering of some of the insurance policies that might be helpful, as in a supply side friction where, for reasons that might involve, say, adverse selection in a market, insurance companies might be reluctant to offer something. Call that one supply friction.
Yeah, that's very insightful. So taking that thread of economic behavior of individuals as agents here in the economy, and also which links to your second part of the lectures, or the second day, and linking that to one of your kind of most recent papers or works on precautionary liquidity and retirement saving, one of your main findings show that individuals opt out of long-term saving plans if it's given as a default allocation, despite the incentives that they're given, highlighting the kind of complex role of liquidity in retirement plan participation. Can you help us understand how you explain those findings, and basically what do you think is happening in that demand side friction, or what is the behavioral challenge, especially when it comes to examples like these? How can we explain them first, and like what is the friction before even moving to like how can we kind of incentivize them?
Yeah, no, I'm delighted that you have looked at that paper and would like to talk about it a little bit. So let me back up to sort of explain the origins of this project, and also to say something about the empirical work that we've done. One of the things I would call in the most interesting research and intellectual developments in thinking about retirement saving, but more generally behavioral economics in the last couple of decades, is the recognition that the choice architecture, the way in which we present choices to individuals, is consequential for the choices they make. About 25 years ago, a project by Bridget Madrian, who was then an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, and Dennis Shea, looked at data for U.S. firms and their retirement savings plans, what are called their 401k plans. And the reform of the plan at the firm they looked at was the following. Used to be that when you arrived at the firm, they'd hand you a packet of papers. In those days, it was a packet of papers. And one of them would be, would you like to contribute to our savings plan? If so, check here. And then how much would you like to contribute? And you could pick a number between, say, 1 and 12%. The firm changed that package to say, we now check the box that says, will you contribute, to be yes. And then underneath it, we say, you'll be contributing 6% of your salary, unless you check this box below it and say, I don't want to contribute to the plan, and I don't want to contribute 6%, and I want to do something else. Okay, now, if I assigned you that problem on a microeconomics exam, and it was neoclassical microeconomics, I think you would say, and the question was, will this change affect savings behavior? I think you would say, doesn't change the budget set, doesn't change the endowment of any of these individuals, so it shouldn't change their choices. And that, of course, is precisely what neoclassical economics would answer. The data did not seem consistent with that. The data showed that there was a very large jump in participation. Maybe 30% of the workforce at this firm was participating incrementally when the default was you're in the plan versus the default being you have to pick a number and sign up. So this got a lot of people thinking about the power of using the way in which we frame choices about defaults and other interventions as a way of encouraging ideas like saving for retirement. Richard Thaler, the Nobel laureate in behavioral economics, has another variant on this, which is you sign up at the firm and the first year you contribute 6%, and then his default, which is an acceleration of your savings, is unless you say otherwise, next year we're going to make it 7, the next year we're going to make it 8, the next year we're going to make it 9. So you're saving more each year. It's called Save More Tomorrow. And that has also shown some evidence that you can increase savings rates with that. The evidence on this has impelled people to think about how could we design defaults, and then what characteristics, what attributes of the default will be most successful in achieving the objectives that we have in mind. So if we're trying to get people to save for retirement, one thing you might do is say, if you put money into this account, you can't access it until retirement. It's locked up. Okay. Another thing you could say is, well, people will say, I don't want to save if that's the structure, so maybe we should allow some flexibility and let people take the money out. And if you look around the world, the structure of retirement savings accounts in different countries is very different. In Australia, for example, very difficult to get the money out. In France, historically pretty difficult to get the money out. In the US, we're reasonably flexible with withdrawals. Although you pay a tax on the withdrawals, you can get the money out. So what the project that I've been doing with Ariane Savars and Marie Briere in France is doing, there was a the French have two kinds of retirement savings plans, something called a medium-term plan and a long-term plan. And the long-term plan says the money is basically, once you contribute, pretty difficult to get it out until you turn 59 and a half, or 59. Might actually be older. 59 may be the US number, maybe older in France.
59 and a half. If I recall
59 and a half.
correctly.
Okay. And in the medium-term plan, money in the plan for 5 years, and then you can withdraw it if you'd like. And what we're trying to figure out is when firms offer both a long-term and a medium-term, and if the medium-term, if the long-term plan is part of the default, which is being offered when folks are working at that firm, are the workers reluctant to end up in the long-term plan? And we find a little bit of evidence that, in fact, when you have the long-term plan and it is structured in such a way that it is the default, that not only reduces the take-up of the default option the plan offers, so people are taking actions to avoid the long-term plan. Now, this is a few percentage of people, so it's not a major shift, but we're trying to get some evidence on, are there significant numbers of folks who are concerned about being in long-term? Seems like the answer is yes. And the other thing we find is that, and this is the finding we are more surprised by, at least I was more surprised by, it looks as though some people just drop out of the plan entirely because the default was a long-term investment. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure how to interpret that, but I think one possibility is that there are cognitive costs of trying to process what do I do with this quite complicated object, the retirement saving plan that my employer is offering. If the default looks pretty good, I just follow the path of least resistance and I stay with the default. If I believe that the default is not great, I recoil from the default. Now, an optimizer with relatively low cost of becoming more expert on this, say you, might read the documents and decide, okay, I will just drop the long-term plan, I'll save in the medium-term plan, everything is fine. A worker who has higher costs of processing the detailed plan documents and figuring out what to do may decide, can't figure this out, I'm just going to drop out of the plan entirely. So we raise the possibility that some kind of choice overload or cognitive load may be at work as we observe things in the way this is playing out. We don't really have definitive evidence on that, and I think that this is an area where studying the role of these choice defaults and understanding how different structures to the default might influence behavior, I think it's a potential growth area in this general neck of the woods.
Thank you so much. I do think that that does speak to the behavioral economics literature on cognitive overload in terms of survey response. So I do think that that's like a fair analysis or interpretation of these results, though also it might be very interesting to understand whether there's like deeper economic behavioral incentives, why people actively opt out of this. I am very tempted to ask you the $1 million question, but before we get there, I want to link to other parts of your work related to retirement income trends. And before we get to that $1 million question, I want to ask you about, given your experience in public finance and all of that very valuable research, what have you observed in terms of like the most kind of recent significant changes in terms of retirement income trends over the past decades? Because I would like to take that conversation then from that into like, okay, then what have we learned dynamically? Then where do we take this and how do we inform policy? But first, I would like to hear more about that kind of bunch of work that you've done.
Okay. Another terrific question to dive in, and we could spend a very long time on this, but I'll try to give you a reasonably succinct answer. Most of my knowledge is about the US, and I've tried to, in connection with my lectures today, learn enough to be able to be conversant on the subjects in the UK. In the US, the most important thing to know about the retirement savings system is that we are in a transition from a world of what I would label traditional pensions And these were pension plans that were employer provided, that provided a lifetime annuity based on your earnings history at the firm, so that it might be something like the firm took your 5 highest years of salary and averaged them. It multiplied that by the number of years you had worked for the firm. Let's say that was 30. And it multiplied that by 1.5% for each year. So 30-year worker, 1.5 is 0.45 times your final 5 years of salary averaged would give you a pension payment which began and paid you for life. Okay, that delivered a stable retirement income for the worker, but it imposed a financial burden on the firm of having to both save enough to deliver that kind of a pension payout and manage the financial risks, which included investment risk as well as longevity risk of the workers. For a variety of reasons, including some legislative developments which were designed to protect the workers in defined benefit plans, firms retreated from the defined benefit world over the course of about 3 decades, beginning in the mid-1970s. And today's workers are largely working in what's called the defined contribution pension world. And that's where what the firm does is it says, I'll contribute 6% of your salary. You can contribute another 6% of your salary. Maybe I'll match your salary and I'll give you an extra 50% if you do. But that's an environment in which the workers, today's 45-year-old workers, are much less likely to be covered by an old-fashioned defined benefit pension plan than they were 25 years ago. As we look forward, what that means is that the way in which we're delivering retirement security going forward is mostly going to depend on the functioning of the defined contribution system. Now, both the US and the UK have important, really substantial, publicly provided pension benefits through state pension. And those programs provide a floor under the available resources for retirees. And it's critical to think about that whenever we discuss the behavior of retired households, whenever we discuss savings, because the notion that someone who does not have a retirement saving plan will end up with nothing in retirement is simply wrong. As long as they have some earnings and are participating in the state plan, they will end up with a publicly provided pension. It may not be as generous as they would like to be, but there's something there to prevent them from falling to the very bottom. And in the US at least, the poverty rate amongst the elderly population is lower than the population rate amongst the younger population, in part because of those programs. So I think the most important thing to keep in mind is we are on this trajectory that is taking us from a world in which, of those who had employer-provided plans, had an annuity being provided in retirement, to one where they're now going to have a pot of resources, the pension pot here in the UK, and then they're going to be responsible for figuring out how to draw that pot down as they go forward. Now, this raises 2 questions. One is the amount that's going into the pot over the course of the working life sufficient to produce a pot that is large enough that, subject to the way you're going to draw it down, will put you in a good position for retirement? But there are questions both about how you try to build the pension pot and then how you draw down the pension pot. And just to give you an example on the second one, you could take your pension pot and you could purchase an annuity contract from an insurance company. That would be a way of essentially replicating the type of a payout stream that you would have from the older style defined benefit pension plan. On the other hand, you might decide that you would like more flexibility in the way the drawdown will take place out of your pension pot. Once you've annuitized, you're going to be paid a certain amount every year. You can always save that amount and then have more for next year, but it's very difficult with an annuity to pull money forward from what you're going to get in the future. On the other hand, with a pension pot that you keep intact, you can decide that I will, if I need more money this year for a medical expense, I just take more money out of the pot. But the challenge of do it yourself is that insurance fundamentally is an attractive idea because you have a risk, I have a risk, and we can pool those risks, and as a result, each of us can be better off from having insured the other. When you are going it alone with your pension pot, that takes away the opportunity to get the benefits that could come from an insurance contract. And deciding exactly how to manage that, both of those are important challenges as we go forward.
This is brilliant. So let me pause for a moment, kind of summarize where we got to, and then I can't hold myself from asking the $1 million question that we're all interested in knowing, what do we do with this knowledge? But so basically, we've spoken so far about kind of the overarching umbrella of supply side and demand side frictions in accessing retirement plans or even demanding them. And as Professor Jim has referred to, that the demand side frictions are a bit more of a problem here in terms of understanding economic behaviors of agents, saving agents. And so basically, and now looping back to the title of this of the lecture and asking the $1 million question. So how do we secure retirement in an aging population?
Yeah, I mean, I fear I may not have a $1 million answer for you, but I will try. The first thing I think is very important is to make sure that if there are frictions that are making it difficult for people to save for retirement, we try to remove those. Why is the beginning of my answer we should try to remove the frictions in the private side? I think given the aging populations in many countries, and neither the UK nor the US are in the vanguard of this. I mean, some parts of continental Europe where birth rates have fallen dramatically are going to have many more older workers, older citizens relative to younger working age folks in 25 and 50 years than the forecast for either the UK or the US suggests. But the demography is going to put pressure on the public sector as a vehicle for delivering retirement security. There's probably no alternative to the public sector for securing the lower part of the income distribution. And I'm not going to guess whether that's a quarter or it's a third, but they're a group of people who've had relatively low earnings careers. They have had difficulty, for good reasons, trying to save enough to build up any kind of a pension pot, let's say. For that group, you almost surely need the public sector to be engaged in securing what they're going to give. And it is even quite reasonable to think that we might want to raise benefits from levels that we are today. Once you move beyond that group, however, the private sector is going to play a pretty important role in delivering retirement resources. And that means thinking about the role of plans like the 401k plan in the US. There are other elements of this that probably need attention and get much less than they probably deserve. For example, many households in the US reach retirement age with a fully paid off house. And they often don't draw down the value of that house until they're in very, very much later in their life. Either many houses pass at death of the seniors. Thinking about market institutions which might allow households to draw some of the resources and kind of a reverse annuity mortgage or something like that might be one interesting way to help support the living standards of some of those older households. But I think that spending time thinking about retirement plan designs for the private sector, avoiding the frictions which may make it hard for small firms to create plans that people can save with, thinking hard about the self-employed and trying to create, and this might require government action as well, to create easy plans for the self-employed to contribute to. We see that in the United States. Some states have been stepping in recently to try, as the economy moves toward a greater share of self-employment and gig workers and others are out there. We're seeing systems that are designed to pull some of those households into the retirement savings system with state-administered plans that they can contribute to. That gives us some movement in the right direction. So I think the savings part of this, I think we more or less know what the tools are, and if in a pinch, one can always say, well, gee, we're just not getting enough, and then you can think about even having some government requirement that workers pay more into the system or employers pay more into the system in order to fund what was out there. But the other piece, so I think those are a set of recommendations. Maintain and strengthen the first system, the first pillar, which is the public pension. Rocks out of the road for allowing the private sector plans to do their work and getting people in as easily as possible. Making these accounts also transferable from employer to employer is probably another feature that is important. And finally, and it's less glamorous, it doesn't get as much attention, thinking about how do we handle the drawdown in retirement. And here, financial education may actually have an important role to play. Many households, as they approach retirement, do not spend a lot of time trying to understand the alternative ways in which they could try to deliver a stream of retirement income for themselves. And this is a pretty big decision, right? For a married couple that's 65 years old today in the UK, the chance that one of them will be alive 30 years later is close to 50%, okay? And what that suggests is that there's a lot of years that are going to be lived in the retirement phase, and we need to be thinking about how households and helping households to think about this. And I think mortality experience is something that people A, don't like thinking about, and B, there's not a lot of easily accessible information on that. So those are also financial education, rocks out of the road for private sector plans. Make sure Social Security and the public pension is delivering what we want for the people we want. Those are part of the recommendations I would sort of throw out.
Amazing. And then picking up on that retirement saving plan thread policy recommendation, what do you think are the distributional impacts of these saving plans? So what's the impact of that on overall economic inequality? Is there any way to design policies to account for more equal impacts on various income groups? So maybe starting in the US, but again, a bit overall as well.
It's a challenging question, but I'm really glad you raised it, because it's a perfect application of the kind of economics that economists are trained to do when thinking through this, because there are both design features that affect equity and there are design features that affect efficiency, and we have to try to understand how it works. The basic fact that you have to start with is that if you look at private saving, whether it's in retirement accounts or it's in just traditional savings vehicles, taxable accounts, it is skewed toward the upper tail of the income and wealth distribution. So if you provide incentives for saving, for example, you reduce the tax liability on income from saving, and maybe you just do it from income in saving, in retirement accounts, a significant part of that benefit is going to go to households that are in the upper tier of the distribution. And it's almost inevitable if you do that without some strong caps on the amount of saving that will be eligible for taxation. The tricky question becomes, do we think that we are getting any additional savings on the part of the higher income households in response to the incentives we are offering? I actually am more optimistic that there are some incentive effects here than many of my peers are, who I think might say, oh, not much happening there. But I think that when you just think about the amounts that people are accumulating in some of these plans, at least in the US, the numbers get pretty large, and they might actually be marginal saving for some of them at some point over their life cycle trajectory. But the what we call distribution tables, which income groups are benefiting, they tend to have a lot of benefits at the top. I would argue for trying to integrate, as one looks at that benefit, the role of the Social Security or the public pension scheme to get an overall picture of what does the direction of government subsidy towards saving do. And I think if you say, well, at least in the US again, we have a more progressive Social Security system at low wages than at high. The fraction of your lifetime earnings that you're expected to earn back as pension benefits from the state is higher if you're a low-income worker than if you're a high-income worker. So that's some bit of redistribution that's running in the opposite direction. And what that essentially means is that the equivalent of the national insurance contributions that workers are making, there's a bit of redistribution which is going on there within our Social Security system. So that it's a partial counterbalance to what's happening on the pure tax side, where the retirement saving benefits are higher at the top. My guess is that the way to ultimately think about this is to say, we'd like to understand, or at least I would like to try to think about it, is we'd like to measure how much incremental saving we get from the various incentive programs. We'd like to think about whether or not the incremental saving is done by households that we think are in need of incremental saving for retirement security, right? If only very rich households are saving more in response to some incentive program, then it's incumbent on us to ask the question, do those host households need extra saving? Even if we're getting the saving, is it something that we feel we need as a public policy matter? And that ultimately it's that trade-off between the equity challenge that comes from where the saving tends to be versus the efficiency of trying to use something which is just lowering a tax burden on the saving to encourage more of it. There's an ultimate trade-off there that we have to think through. And different observers, different analysts will surely come to different conclusions based on their social welfare weights for different parts of the income distribution.
So thinking about the income distribution, but also different agents in the economy, what do you think is the role of firms in setting these retirement plans, but also in setting them in a way that takes into account economic inequality? What is the role of firms in that?
I think firms are critical. Okay, so first off, really big role, because I think if you just rely on individuals to make these choices themselves, many people will not get organized to do it. You could rely on the government, bigger than the firm still, but at a minimum, the firm, particularly because it seems that for many purposes, workplace contributions to things are a pretty effective way of making contributions. The U.S. has the U.S. has a variety of things that are done in the workplace, and therefore it's not totally out of spirit to be doing this, at least in the U.S. there. But I do think that recognizing that firms are heterogeneous is very important, and that for a small firm, firm with 25 employees, it may be quite burdensome to pay the annual fixed costs of having an auditor come in and review your pension plan and having to build up the document base and having to consult with lawyers when it's time to modify and update the plan. Those things can cost money, and it may be that's part of the reason why the firms don't do it. The other thing is, different firms have different compositions of their workforce. If you have a workforce that's turning over rapidly, the workers may not stay long enough to contribute very much to the plan. If you're in a world like today in the US, where it's actually a little difficult to move the plan from one place to another, you move your contributions, it may be that you just decide as an employer, this is just not worth it. And that may be the wrong decision socially, but you can sort of see how the worker might get there, how the employer might get there as they consider it. So I think the challenge in some ways is to make good use of the firm as a conduit here, but recognize that there are costs on firms, so that when we impose regulations which ask the firms to do something, we're not simply saying, go do this without any attempt to cover the cost or to keep them whole as they're trying to navigate this.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. Now, shifting from microeconomic agents to flows of those agents, both within the economy, but as well as internationally, where does migration come into the picture? So what is the impact of designing tax policies on migration? First, what do we know about that? And then second, how can we design tax policy, or what's the role of that in accounting for migration, both domestically, but as well as internationally?
I think you have to distinguish two things when you start to talk about migration. One is the migration of high-income households that is driven by taxes, cost of living, and benefit standards, and the other is migration of lower-income households, which can often be driven by earnings opportunities, in many cases by political turmoil and other things like that. Migration is absolutely first order for thinking about the viability of social security systems and public pensions. If you have large flows of migrants into your country, and they are working in the formal sector so that you're getting tax revenue from them on their jobs, that is a game changer in terms of your ability to run a traditional pay-as-you-go social security system, because that flow of tax revenue makes up for what declining fertility rates may be eroding on other reasons. So, the U.S., in this sense, the U.S. is a relatively fortunate country because we do have a significant flow of migrants, and the migrants do get into the U.S. labor market. So that provides some important resources to be able to keep the social security system afloat. The migrants tend to be relatively young. Okay? And in many cases, they also work for a few years, and some of them return to their home countries. So they're a windfall for a social security system. That's not necessarily a windfall for the entire social safety net, but at least for Social Security, this works. The tax factors in terms of driving this, I think most of the tax design questions for immigrants really focus on the top end. And there's evidence within the EU and elsewhere that tax rates do matter for migration decisions, that low tax rate jurisdictions are more successful at attracting very well compensated workers. The flows, I'll say, I'm not an expert on spatial or urban economics, but I think the fundamental trade-off becomes how valuable is it to be in a particular location where there are other complementary benefits for whatever labor market activity you engage in. If you want to work in the financial services sector, being near and in proximity to Wall Street is valuable. So New York becomes a hub, or London becomes a hub in which to live and work. On the other hand, there are many other roles where in the economy where there isn't a concentrated point of professional connectivity. And for those jobs, you might well be able to migrate to a U.S. state with a very low tax rate, or migrate in Europe. I think we also see, migration is also important at the pensioner level. And Portugal, for example, in the last couple of decades, has tried to make itself more attractive to other EU residents who can come to Portugal by essentially exempting many of the tax burdens that would normally fall on these older workers, older households. And that, I think it's been pretty successful, because they've actually managed to attract households that would not have otherwise come. It's been able to boost their economy because these folks are spending, but it has come, from the standpoint of Portugal per se, it hasn't lost a lot of revenue because it wouldn't have had that many people before. So this is all kind of a Laffer curve type of thing of, understanding what the incremental revenue is from pushing up the marginal tax rate, and at what point you might get into situations where you can save as we go along.
Great. Now I just want to kind of zoom out into your kind of experience. What made you interested in tax policy, and what do you think has been your most influential work in kind of contributing to tax and retirement policy?
Well, the way I got interested in taxation goes back to my days in high school in the U.S. I was on my high school's debating team, and every academic year, there would be a topic chosen for debate, and we would work on that topic and learn more and more every year. So the four topics that were debated during my 4 years in high school were resolved that the federal government should finance primary and secondary education in the United States. In the U.S., many school districts rely on local taxes, property taxes, to fund their schools. And this was proposing, say, a value-added tax or a federal income tax to replace it. The next year was resolved that the federal government should guarantee a minimum annual income to all households. The next year was a political topic about changing the way that we select presidential and vice presidential candidates. And the final one, and an economist could hardly ask for a better title, was resolved that an international organization should control the allocation of scarce world resources. So it was the market versus the state. Well, by the time I'd done these 3 economics topics during high school, I had decided that economics was fun, and I was hooked. And that was very much what led me in this direction. And 2 of those 3 topics were really about public finance. And that, I think, somehow either for lack of creativity to move beyond what I had seen, or because something resonated here, I enjoyed working on those issues and have continued to do that. The issues around retirement saving, I think the key thoughts around how do we ensure the longevity risk part of this is one of the things that I've basically been focusing on. And I think that some combination of understanding that there are both macro and micro consequences of an aging population, and thinking about the way in which people draw down their income in retirement, those are the places where I probably think the impact of my work has probably been greatest.
Let's just conclude by any general advice that you have for our graduate students here, or graduate students in general.
I think the work I have done on retirement security, while I confess for most graduate students and early stage faculty members, it's not top of mind, but it is motivated by first order questions for societies. right? And a lot of economic resources to be allocated in terms of what we're doing. And I would take the broad lesson from that, which is I think it's really good to try to find topics for research which come from what's happening in the economy. And it doesn't mean just the public sector, but you can think about today in the United States, there's more interest in tariffs, for example. We're seeing challenges to globalization, and there are questions about how that's all working out. So I think those are the kinds of questions that one would sort of be looking toward. But you can say the same thing for artificial intelligence and its impact on the economy, or inequality, and trying to think through the macro consequences as well as the micro consequences. Be about the economy, not about the economics literature, is one thing that I would offer as a bit of advice, because I think that's a good way of finding a topic that will probably have some staying power in terms of what you work on.
Well, Professor Jim, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation, and we look forward to your lecture later today, but also tomorrow.
Thank you. This has been great fun. Thank you so much.